Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. With spring in the air, we're back out of the studio and over to one of my favorite little bistros in the South End, Aquitaine on Tremont. An old colleague from the venture capital industry, Michael Greeley with Foundation Medical Partners, has joined me to share a drink and some stories about the amazing economic flourishing he's witnessed in Vietnam. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bill. Great to be here.
Michael, before we get started, perhaps a little attitude adjustment.
I would love that.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are you?
Hey, John. How are you?
Well, thank you. Care for a cocktail or a glass of wine or beer while you're...
So I would love a drink. I am a tequila drinker. Perhaps the Yellow Lantern?
Okay, delicious, yeah.
And I'll do a Doers on the Rocks with a splash.
Easy enough.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, Michael, while we're waiting for our drinks, let's get some background. Like the majority of the population of Vietnam, young Americans really only know about the long and bitter war we fought there from history books. Before we dig in, give us a little perspective. You spent much of your youth in Hong Kong in the immediate aftermath of the communist victory in Vietnam. What do you remember about that?
So you're right, Bill. I grew up in Hong Kong, having lived a little bit in Madrid prior to that. I consider myself a New Yorker, but we
won't hold that against you here in Boston.
I've been in Boston for 20 years. We moved to Hong Kong in the early 70s when Mao was sick, and it was clear that China was about to change. My father was sent over to open the office for Chase Manhattan Bank. And what was extraordinary about that time was how China was just beginning to open up. So we would travel as a family into southern China for day trips, and we would have handlers take us on these very structured guided tours. And so it looked like such a foreign, alien world. Everybody was wearing blue and green Mao suits. My brother and sister had blonde hair, and people were touching their hair. And
they hadn't seen outsiders.
They hadn't seen that before. Yeah. And right at the beginning of that time, the Vietnamese boat people phenomenon was so present.
The refugees.
Yeah, for those that, I'm sure you've been to Hong Kong. It's principally a major island off the coast of China, but there are probably 200 islands that encompass Hong Kong. And we would routinely see these junks, these boats come in that have clearly been on the water for weeks with people hanging on them. What was most horrifying was occasionally you would see people who didn't make it come through the Hong Kong harbor. I had a Hobie cat, so I was probably 10 at the time, 10 or 12, and would sail on the backside of Hong Kong Island in a town called Stanley, and you would see all of these either Chinese sort of gunboats or the Hong Kong patrolling or the British Navy patrolling, and they were looking to intercept these boats coming in full of all these tragic
even tougher
refugees.
Than coming to Miami from Cuba.
Awful. And so that's where I was going. We think how awful that is, and it is awful, but that's 90 miles, 100 miles. The Malaysia air tragedy, as you look at those maps every day, and I look at them and I see the distances between these
They came a long way.
These are thousands of miles in open water, and these are hostile waters. They're pirates. They're all the... And it got to the point where Hong Kong was, at the time, had 6 million people, and it was overcrowded as it was. Where do you put hundreds of thousands of desperate refugees? And so my mother, to her great credit, with a lot of expatriates, began to volunteer in these camps. And for those that could remember, Kai Tak Airport was the airstrip coming into Hong Kong. It was the center of the harbor. Just off to one side of it were these enormous cargo yards where the cargo would be unloaded, and they'd put barbed wire fence around that, and they'd literally just stack these people right in the harbor.
What else do you do, right?
What can you do?
Fleeing for their lives. If you imagine what drove them out.
And Hong Kong had no resources to settle, and the Chinese weren't going to take them, and they came in such volumes over a number of years, and you just stacked them up. And I can remember going occasionally. I was 10 or 12 years old, and just being so shocked that somebody took that risk and ended up in that condition, and they felt
they were ahead of the game.
They felt safe.
So what were they leaving behind in the aftermath of the communist victory? What was there?
What was left of Vietnam?
In Vietnam.
So I hadn't traveled to Vietnam in the 70s, but we all have these images of how horrific it was. Ironically, and we'll talk about it, I've been over there a number of times since. Vietnam's been a country that's gone through a series of conquerors, the French, the Chinese, Japanese. And I think what they were fleeing from was as the North invaded the South, just the sense of revenge and the persecution that was just the bloodbath. And it was horrific. And, and this was on the heels of what we all know to be just an absolutely devastating war that we in some sense inflicted on that country. I was over there a couple weeks ago. I took my kids back. So one of my philosophies in life is to take my children overseas a couple times a year. And I hadn't taken them yet to Asia. And when you're in Ho Chi Minh, there's
Ho Chi Minh City.
Ho Chi Minh City. There are reminders of the war very visibly in a lot of the park common
and you mentioned the museum
spaces
that you had been to.
Yeah, this museum, the War Memorial Museum, which is in the center of Ho Chi Minh City, it's an unimpressive building. It's 3 floors. In the juxtaposition of all of our captured armaments in the courtyards, the tanks, the carriers, and then you walk into this building that's, frankly, in reasonably poor shape. And it's just a series of photographs.
Yeah.
And there's a room called the Agent Orange Room. And this visual will never leave me, and certainly not my children. You walk in and you see how we had carpet bombed this country. So this is late 60s, obviously, and defoliated just enormous forests. And they had photos of before and after villages. So we were putting dioxin over many square miles.
You got to ask yourself, what were they thinking?
What were our...
Yeah.
And, listen, I love this country. I think having grown up overseas, I love this country probably more than the average American. But I think it enables me to be more critical. We're up in arms when the Syrian dictator dumps a bomb in Aleppo, and yet we were carpet bombing this country. Anyway, it just the devastation we inflict on that population. So the boat people crisis is right on the heels of that experience. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways they were facing political persecution, but also the country was so devastated by the war. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of these people said, roll the dice, there's a better life. Mm-hmm. But it's an extraordinary country.
Well, talk about the people who stayed behind and then grew up under communism. America turned its back for 20 years, and that period has passed now. I guess the first question that always interests me, I haven't been to Vietnam, I've had friends that have been there, is how are you treated as an American given the history?
I've been there a handful of times in the last few years for very different reasons, and each time I expected, geez, it's inevitable I'm going to bump into somebody who's going to hate me or say something sideways. Interestingly, the only slightly negative comment I received on my last trip was somebody who was probably close to 50 had said, "It's really too bad you lost the war." And he started laughing, and that was the only sideways comment. They refer to the war as the American aggression, which is natural. Cynics would say that victory is written through is told through the eyes of the victor.
Winner, history.
And it's the most charming, warm place I've ever been. They were so embracing. And what struck me was how young the population is. Something like 2/3 is less than 25 years old. 92 million. Incredibly adept with technology. There are 20 million Facebook accounts. If you just look at all these funny metrics,
they're coming up fast.
They're very smart. They're very sophisticated with technology, and consequently, they're actually incredibly worldly. And what I found so endearing, they're exposed. And what I found so endearing is how forgiving they are. They have made peace with the war. I think many of the younger Vietnamese, much like in our country, don't really remember the war. Undoubtedly, they know people who died. What you'll hear in the museum particularly is that 3 million Vietnamese perished.
Right.
A horrific tragedy. We lost 55,000 boys over there. But they, I think, have made peace with it. They're moving on. It's not unlike, I read with fascination, the Rwanda
Sure. But so here they survived the war. They survived communism. And they have now embraced markets with a vengeance. They've been growing at, 7% over the last...
Yeah, the growth rates are extraordinary. But what I'm really taken by when you're over in those places is in many ways, they're more capitalistic and probably have been for a long time than parts of our economy.
We're moving away from that, and they seem to be moving toward it.
If you want to build a building in Boston, it may take you 5 to 10 years to get the right permits. If you want to build a building in Ho Chi Minh City, you're probably breaking ground within months, and the building's built, and you're off and running. So that my sense is actually talked to some really interesting entrepreneurs when I was there, is the level of innovation and vitality and permissiveness for this generation is really quite extraordinary.
Now, what do you mean by permissiveness?
People are encouraged to take risk, to start companies. A good friend of mine runs the largest venture firm over there. he is overwhelmed with the number of inbound inquiries about getting funding to start companies.
No kidding.
And it's not just in the most obvious sectors of kind of internet, consumer internet. It's actually also touching hardcore technologies, healthcare, which I know is near and dear to your heart. There's a whole set of opportunities about reinventing in healthcare, particularly delivery models. So what does a new hospital look like? How do you re-architect those kind of consumer services, business services?
And they're bootstrapping. Where's the capital coming from?
Truly, the cost of labor is effectively free. But the risk of that
So there's a comparative advantage, right?
An enormous comparative
advantage. So they must
advantage.
have a huge garment industry. Isn't that usually where people start?
Huge garment industry.
In textiles?
Chinese companies have outsourced low-end manufacturing to Vietnam. So there's this
cascading. It's cheaper there than, it's their
cascading
turn.
down into Southeast Asia. The cost of free labor effectively is the risk of overbuilding. So in Ho Chi Minh, you'll see a number of buildings which were started and not completed. So there may be a little bit of an absorption issue in that. Is there enough high-end businesses to support, office towers?
Right.
And so they're half-finished office towers.
There's a lot of that going on in China, too.
A lot of that in China.
Yeah. A lot of that happened in Miami, too. And we've recovered from that. So talk a little bit about the nature of the Vietnamese entrepreneur, and not just tech, but how do they approach it? How do they deal with financing? How do they deal with failure? How do they deal with information and growth? All the things we take for granted here. What's it like over there?
So what I observed, Bill, was given the proliferation of content, communications, their understanding of other successful models is actually incredibly high. So this fund that I had alluded to has 30 portfolio companies, and he translated effectively every successful business model here. So there's an eBay of Vietnam, a PayPal of Vietnam. He's backed all of those.
So it's like New England and the textile industry going over to London and saying, I could do that too. They're basically copying our...
That's
good
right.
for them.
And that's enabled because they actually have great understanding of what those businesses look like.
Right.
There's this phenomenon of sea turtles, which are Vietnamese students returning home.
They call them sea turtles?
To launch businesses. And many of them worked at Google or Microsoft here, figured out those business practices and went home to go replicate it. And so I think what you're seeing now is an incredibly enthusiastic young population that is saying, I know the roadmap to build these businesses, and I can create the Vietnamese version of it very easily. There are probably half a dozen venture funds over there.
And are they getting rich?
The Vietnamese entrepreneurs? I think on a relative basis, they are certainly richer than their parents ever imagined that they would be. The one concern that local investors expressed to me was Vietnam isn't really high on the priority list of multinational acquirers. Right. So you can build really interesting businesses that are break-even or profitable.
It's hard to exit.
And there's no real public market, so to speak.
So is that an opportunity to create a public market there?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how much liquidity you'd see in those markets because they ultimately are pretty small markets. So a lot of these entrepreneurs don't tell a Vietnamese story; they tell a Southeast Asia story. So they try and tell a larger story. And in fact, this fund that I've alluded to a couple times invests in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So they tell a 600 million person footprint.
That's a pretty
story.
Big footprint.
That's a big footprint. That's twice as big as the United States.
A lot of consumers.
Yeah, that's a really big market.
How are they doing in the rule of law department?
My understanding is poor but improving rapidly. And I think most developing economies get it that in order to have real capital flows and capital markets, the rule of law matters more than they ever probably wildly imagined.
Are they studying the Singapore model or the Dubai model at all?
I don't know.
Because rather than reinventing commercial law, why don't you just rent British law? That seems to be working around the world. I haven't figured that out yet.
And I know the funds that I've talked to use traditional U.S. term sheets, and so the notion of preferred stock, which frankly in many other markets is sort of alien, that you'd have a preferred class.
What does that mean, right?
But they don't understand that. That's taken hold in Vietnam. What I have seen a lot of entrepreneurial activity around low-end services businesses. So when you go around the city of Ho Chi Minh, and it is chaos. Everybody is on a scooter or Vespa.
They're not in cars yet.
They're not in cars. Thank God they're not in cars.
So it's like China 15 years ago.
Times 10.
Times 10.
Just at every intersection.
Because everybody has a shiny new car in China.
At every intersection in Ho Chi Minh, there would literally be multiple hundreds of scooters lined up. The light turns yellow to red, and they fire off. But as you go through the streets, what you see is a lot of storefronts that you think at first it says Starbucks. There are half a dozen Starbucks now, and you get closer to it, and it's some derivative of Starbucks. And so there are a lot of service businesses, low-end retail that is being introduced to the market. And those are undoubtedly entrepreneurs who've said, I've seen pictures of Starbucks.
I could do something like that.
I kind of get it.
But why would people stand in line at McDonald's in Ho Chi Minh City? I read your blog post. I was shocked. Share that with us.
So the first McDonald's franchise was just opened about 6 weeks ago.
6 weeks, so it's really fresh and new.
Very fresh. McDonald's has been considering entering the market, what I understand, for about 10 years. A great friend of mine, parenthetically, who married the Prime Minister's daughter, was one of those babies. Imagine fleeing our embassy on the helicopter, leaving the country. He ended up going to Harvard, and he's one of the
That's a tough way to get into Harvard.
He's returned, and he spent a lot of time in Chicago. He went to Kellogg and as an MD also from Northwestern. Was convinced that McDonald's had a real bright future in Vietnam. So he'd been cultivating this relationship.
They're not all vegetarians there?
Not all vegetarians. And finally, he secured the license. So he's opened a McDonald's. And we were there. I took my kids there at midnight at shift change. There are 250 employees.
At midnight?
At midnight. It was jammed. 250 employees. It's 13,000 square feet. So it's not, it's a normal-sized store. It was so popular that people were queued up hundreds deep outside the storefront. They had red carpet, the velvet
it's like
ropes.
Studio 54.
It was like a Hollywood opening. All the orderers had handheld devices taking orders
for Big Macs.
For Big Macs. For late at night, there were a lot. It must have been some drunken
And is it the
Vietnamese.
same Big Mac we have here?
Same Big Mac. My son ordered whatever their soft ice cream, and he thought it was better than what he had in the States. And it is an event. It is deemed a high-end restaurant. I think Ho Chi Minh City could support 20 of them quite easily. This is the most successful in the entire McDonald's network, the third most successful store opening, behind Moscow and a store in China, both of which were 3 times as large. So if you kind of, on a per square footage basis, it was an explosive opening. It's
clearly not about the food. What is it about the American culture that they find so appealing?
So there are statues of Ronald McDonald, which in some sense would be sort of horrific to see this flaming red hair character in big shoes. So he's everywhere. So there's a brand that they get is very Americana.
And they're drawn to it.
They're very drawn to it.
We drop bombs on their head, and now they want to eat our hamburgers.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is we saw a lot of fat little kids.
Yeah, that too.
Up.
Right.
And so we've exported some interesting businesses. Yeah. We're also exporting our poor habits. There were 2 drive-through lanes. People on these scooters were queued up to order McDonald's for drive-through. They have a delivery service that runs around Ho Chi Minh delivering Big Macs. It was a surreal phenomenon. And then we went back of house, and we watched the poor lady. There's one employee who gets the order and puts the buns into the toaster. Mm-hmm. And she's putting in hundreds of buns a minute into this toaster. And she looked like an octopus. Her arms are flying so fast.
She's like Lucy on the candy line. Yeah. Young people won't understand that reference, but you understand it.
That's exactly right. It was surreal. And then you pinch yourself thinking you're in Ho Chi Minh City at midnight with your children in the back of a house of McDonald's. But it's inevitable. With understanding of our culture, I think the Vietnamese are going to insist and demand on more of those.
So, Michael, you indicated that there was some interesting activity in healthcare markets there. Maybe you can describe a little bit about that to us, and then bring it back here to the U.S.
The healthcare system in Vietnam, understandably, is quite antiquated. There are 2 newly privatized hospitals, and so there's a lot of emphasis on reinventing basic healthcare services. Most people get healthcare from the pharmacy.
From the pharmacy?
From the pharmacy.
We're headed that way.
We're absolutely headed that way. So it's a provocative question because we're coming kind of full circle to that. If you have a complicated case, you leave the country if you can afford it. You go to Singapore, Malaysia.
We haven't reached that point yet.
We have not. Although we do have a lot of medical tourism leaving the country. And so there is a recognition that healthcare needs to improve pretty dramatically. Mm-hmm. My sense is we're not going to see great innovation on novel therapies and devices over there, but there will be...
Yeah, why do they need to do that?
They don't need to
do delivery. They need to solve the delivery problem.
They need to move life expectancy from 50 to 60 years or whatever the specific numbers are, and that can be readily achieved by just better, more consistent care delivery.
Sure. The mundane stuff.
And so a lot of emphasis that you'll hear over there is on that. Where, in our market, a lot of the emphasis is extending it from 77 to 80 years.
Yeah, so 80 to 90, 90 to 140. But, yeah. Let's come back to the States. Before we started, we talked about how tough the venture capital business is. But share with us your perspective on opportunities right here at home.
In healthcare specifically,
Yeah.
I think the great next frontier is around the business of healthcare, which means most definitely not therapeutics and devices. That, as you alluded to, those business models are inconsistent with venture capital.
And who wants to take the regulatory risk?
It's criminal.
Yeah.
And then you've got this punishing reimbursement paradigm, and just on and on and on. And just even the development risks are excruciating. And so I focused in the last number of years and actually have raised a new fund to go after the business of healthcare transformation. And, there's some profound forces at work here. Payment reform, the role of the consumer. We touched on the pharmacy. I think businesses like CVS is an extraordinary company in many ways. It has 7,600 stores. The revenues are $125 billion. So it's actually it's not a retailer. They have a retail presence, but the bulk of the revenues are around more data-centric businesses. And I think another phenomenon, just maybe being a little nonlinear, last week when CMS published the reimbursement by doctors' names.
Oh, did that set the doctors alight?
So
my wife's a doctor, and they're all checking each other's reimbursements.
God. So that poor fool in Florida, that ophthalmologist, billed $21 million.
Yeah.
Next year, he's not going to bill $21 million.
Yeah, if they don't burn his house down.
Or he may be in jail.
Right.
And so I think you'll see, like we saw in fintech and advertising, every other vertical, easy first steps just around transparency is going to change behavior.
Well, we have a system where we have Sovietized the pricing model. In every other industry you and I are used to, prices signal something. They signal opportunity. Where do I invest? Where should I do cost reduction? We have some guy in Washington that sets prices, and that whole signaling machine is broken.
It's crazy.
How do you cope with that as a VC investor?
So you have to take a leap of faith that with payment reform and transparency, that executives who run these providers or payers are going to have to behave more economically rational. And
how do they do that without pricing information?
I think they certainly have cost information.
Mm-hmm.
Pricing is disaggregated from the settlement process. So whatever the price is obviously independent because there's arm wrestling in the background to figure out how it gets settled. My sense is one of the most important drivers is the introduction of you and me as patients/consumers. You're going to demand, as you now have either high deductible plans and with other elements of payment reform, you're going to demand to know the quality and the price of the services that any one provider is giving.
Like any other business.
I
negotiate with my dentist.
Do you really?
Absolutely. I go for a filling. I got a quote across the street. He matches it.
That's
I pay cash out of pocket. You don't negotiate with your
dentist? I haven't
dentist?
even thought to do that, but that's extraordinary.
I negotiate with my dentist every year. Why not?
And are you getting prices?
He always matches.
Nice.
Takes 2 phone calls.
Nice.
When are we going to start doing that for appendicitis? Well, that's kind of a different
If it's an urgent situation, you're in a pretty vulnerable position.
That's true.
So I think the role of the consumer, which is why to come back to it, CVS and those types of models that become on-ramps for consumer engagement in healthcare and how we buy our healthcare services become really interesting. And ultimately, if you see shift in spend or shift in wallet, providers will react and they'll insist on, what they're going to hold obsessively hard to is revenue streams. So if they see degradation in revenue, they'll change their behavior.
So you think there still are venture returns to be had here?
I have to say that because I've just raised a fund on this strategy. I'm absolutely convinced that the business of healthcare will, like we saw in every other industry vertical, new franchises are going to get created, venture-backed franchises that'll have extraordinary value.
So, Michael, before we started recording, I told you how burned out I was in this business. Why are you still doing this?
But, Bill, I told you how re-energized you look. I've never seen you look this happy. So I was a chemist at college. I went to Williams, took my medical school exams, but never went to medical school. Obviously, I'm an investor. And to some extent, this is an ability or an opportunity for me to complete something that I never finished, which was, being active in the healthcare field. What I've concluded is I can actually have a very significant impact on many, many lives. Obviously, I'm sort of one derivative away by seeing these companies be successful. Yeah, I think you can move the needle. I have a brother who's a doctor, and he does, for a month each year, Doctors Without Borders. And he says it's that 1 month. He goes to Cambodia.
Must energize him.
That gets him through the other
Yeah,
11 months.
I bet.
But as you said, the venture business has been really freaking difficult the last 10 years.
Brutal. The public has no idea because they just see the success stories.
Yeah. And, the dirty secret is our industry funds 3,000 or 4,000 companies a year, of which, probably a few dozen are actually
Right, make it.
material. But when they work, it's extraordinary. And, you and I have had the great privilege of working with some of the best minds in the industry. And
no regrets.
yeah, and I couldn't imagine going to, a big company every day. So,
Michael, I really appreciate the time. I enjoy the drink. Thanks for being on the show.
thank you, Bill.
You've been listening to Michael Greeley, General Partner at Foundation Medical Partners, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Thanks to the folks at Aquitaine on Tremont for their hospitality. Ahead, it's back to the studio to chat with technology industry maven Esther Dyson about the contemplated surrender of the top internet governance organization to the UN and our own project in healthcare. Stay tuned.